We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com. Exclusive videos, blogs, links to all of the social media sites, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Find every episode of Booked on Rock there, along with links to your favorite listening platforms. Lisa Torem is a returning guest. Her latest book is another from the Sonic Bond on-track series. It's Suzanne Vega, Every Album, Every Song. Suzanne Vega's career spans nearly 40 years. She rose to prominence in the mid-'80s with the hit singles Marlene on the Wall, Left of Center, and Luka. Her song Tom's Diner, we can't forget about that one, originally released as an a cappella in 1987, was remixed in 1990 as a dance track and went on to reach the top 10 in over 5 countries. Lisa's here to talk about the stories behind Vega's hits, why she was given the title the Mother of the MP3, and a whole lot more. Find a playlist of Suzanne Vega on the show notes page. Lisa, welcome back. This is your 3rd episode.
3's the charm. Thank you very much.
3 is a charm. We had you on for Billy Joel. I think the first one was Suzanne. No, Billy Joel 1, Torem 2. Mm-hmm. Now we're here to talk about Suzanne Vega. Before we got started on all of this, I said, well, I got to really get myself familiarized with her music. I knew the hits, but boy, you got me into a whole new artist here where I'm just diving into her whole catalog. I love it. Love it.
That's the idea. That's wonderful.
So let's get started. Suzanne, she never intended to achieve commercial success, which is interesting. She was more about discovering her voice as a poet and a storyteller. So really all this commercial success that she got was just kind of by happenstance. She started out performing with just her acoustic guitar in New York's Greenwich Village in the early 80s, very old school Dylan-like. Can you talk about those early days in Suzanne's career, how she was influenced by not just folk artists like Dylan, but also Lou Reed, which is interesting?
Yeah, well, in terms of Dylan, there was an article, Women on Bob Dylan in The Guardian, and she said he opened up the incredible imaginary world. Now, that's interesting because that's the imaginary world. There was also Jack Hardy, who was her folk writing mentor, and they used to have these parties with lots of wine and lots of potluck, and they would be very, they'd critique each other. But in terms of Lou Reed, I think he opened the door to a very liberating portal because she had written, I think, more intellectually in a way. But then she saw Lou Reed in New York. He didn't shy away from showing raw emotion. And there were aspects of his performance that were very visceral. I mean, he would, for example, kind of pantomime using drugs on stage. And it's not that she was a stranger to that. She grew up in New York, Spanish Harlem. She'd seen all kinds of behavior. But it gave her license to say, oh, I can be really visceral. I can be real city. I can bring the city into my lyrics. Because she had sort of grown up with a whole host of music, but there were things like the conventional Woody Guthrie and riding the trains and things like Stew Ball, like Leadbelly, kind of stuff that really had very little to do with being a New York City person. So she went to see him. She was really impressed and is sort of in awe. She came home with a stack of albums and she sat down and wrote a beautiful bittersweet song called Cracking, which was really a heartbreaking song, but it was about melting down. It was very real.
Cracking, that actually, it's a good segue right into that first album. She was signed by A&M Records. Mm-hmm. Her self-titled debut is released May of 1985. Number 91 in the U.S., number 11 in the U.K. Interesting. She had a bigger following there at first. The album was produced by Steve Adabo and Lenny Kaye. Mm-hmm. And you write about how Suzanne and Steve had a few contentious moments. Can you explain why he asked her to sing vocal tracks with her guitar, even though she wasn't playing it? And I believe he even taped it to her hands, right?
Yeah, pretty rad. But, a lot of artists that accompany themselves, I know Billy Joel he'd have his producers do little tricks to get him away from the piano. They're really comfortable with that appendage, and Suzanne was really comfortable in the folk clubs playing guitar and singing at the same time. But Steve Adabo, he was a relatively new producer, by the way, and he was working with Lenny Kaye, who was very experienced, and it was a bit of trial and error, but he wanted a lot of vocal clarity. And so he wanted her to concentrate on singing without playing the guitar. And this made her feel uncomfortable. She was not used to this world of the studio world. It was kind of this wires and behind it was a much more artificial world that she was used to, and she's alone without the audience. So she was resistant. And finally, he came up with this idea of just taping up the string so she could sit there and mock play the guitar or whatever she wanted without actually playing the guitar. And ultimately, even though there was a little tension for a spell, they did get the sound that they both wanted. So it was actually a full decision.
She thought it was silly. She's like, why am I doing this? But it just put her in her comfort zone, because she's still a brand new recording artist. Up until that point, she's playing pretty much her and her guitar live. Yeah, interesting. So 3 singles from the album: Marlene on the Wall, Small Blue Thing, and Night Moves. And the song Marlene on the Wall was the last song Suzanne wrote for the album, went to number 21 in the UK. Can you talk about what or who it's about and why Suzanne considered dropping it from the album, which is surprising because that might be my favorite track from that debut album?
Well, it was a hit in Europe. It had achieved a high level of fandom, but it did have sort of this unorthodox rhythm, and it wasn't really coming together in the studio. Now, guitarist John Gordon, I've got a nice picture of him in the book with his pretty blue guitar. He kind of observed what was going on, and he said to Suzanne, well, it's an up-tempo song in a major key. Now, she was kind of used to doing kind of the sad, depressing songs, and she'll joke about this on stage. But this was a rare up-tempo song, and he said, you should definitely do it for that reason. So he went to Woodshed, and he was inspired also by Stuart Copeland, who was the Police drummer. And Copeland had this interesting reggae style of playing drums. I believe that Suzanne feels that John saved the arrangement because of that, because what happened is he arranged to have a different kind of beat, and it really helped the song with the structure. And so it also had a positive message. It was really about emotional renewal and reinventing oneself. And Suzanne recognized that in the song, and it's still, I believe, one of her favorites. And it is about this German actress, Marlene Dietrich. She had a poster on her wall, and I think it was sort of almost a voyeuristic thing of like, oh, if somebody comes over, I've got Marlene Dietrich on my shoulder, kind of watching everything I do. You know, it's kind of that kind of ghosty feeling in the lyric. And it has this kind of stunning anthemic quality. It's really quite a catchy song, and I think it did take the team to get it to that point.
I think I connect with it too because I love classic film. So I knew Marlene Dietrich's name from Turner Classic Movies. Watch it all the time. My dad and I used to always talk about, hey, did you see that movie on TCM? She records the song Left of Center with Joe Jackson for the Pretty in Pink movie in 1986, and that's a top 40 UK single. It was included on her live album, Live in London, 1986. But she comes back with studio album number 2, Solitude Standing. April 1st, 1987, it's released. This is her commercial breakthrough. Certified platinum, goes to number 11 in the US, number 2 in the UK. Suzanne was confident, but fearful of the notorious sophomore slump, which can happen a lot, but she certainly avoided that. Interesting quote from Steve Adabo, however. He said some staff changes at A&M proved beneficial. Can you share what he had to say about that?
There were what they called arrangement and repertoire people back in the day. I'm not sure how it works now, but the A&R people would be pretty much responsible for micromanaging projects. And so what would happen is the A&R people would maybe bring in a guest, and the guest didn't really work with the chemistry of the existing band members. And so Steve wasn't particularly happy with that, because things would get juggled all around, and, oh, here's this guy maybe from LA, and he should do this kind of solo, and it kind of tosses everything in a different direction. So what happened is once these particular A&R people left, Lanny and Steve and Suzanne had more authority in terms of making creative decisions. So they took a breath, they exhaled and said, oh, okay, we've got it back. And he was a happy camper.
The singles are Gypsy, Luka, Tom's Diner, and Solitude Standing. And you lead the entry on the track Tom's Diner by writing, who would have suspected that this simple melody would go gangbusters on the charts, or that the idea would evolve in such an unremarkable setting? There are 2 versions of this song, an a cappella version and a dance remix. This I found really interesting because the dance remix wasn't even planned, certainly not by Suzanne and her camp. it had been written 5 years before. That's the other thing that's interesting. It's based on a real place, and chances are you've either been there. I know you've been there because the picture of you in the book sitting there, or you've seen it on TV many times if you're a fan of Seinfeld. Can you talk about the origins of the song lyrics for
Yep.
Tom's Diner?
Absolutely. There is actually a restaurant called Tom's Restaurant. And if you go to the Columbia University area, it's very close to that area. It's close to St. John's Church Cathedral, which has this bell, and you'll hear that reference to the song. And so it's a traditional diner style restaurant with the wall to wall windows and the vinyl booths and the never ending coffee pot and the friendly waitresses. And in Seinfeld, the American show Seinfeld, you also see the central characters meeting there. So it's become sort of a great movie interior set. And it inspires Suzanne because she would go there. She was, I believe, working as a receptionist, didn't have a lot of money. And it was one of those rare places where you can just, buy the coffee and sit there for a few hours and write in your journal and nobody bothers you. And there was always a passing parade. There was always some drama outside the window. And so she was taking copious notes about what was going on. And so that's really how she came up with that narrative. And like you said, it was a cappella, at that point. But it was a great place to write.
Yeah, the a cappella version would also lead to Suzanne being called the mother of the MP3. Why is that?
Well, a scientist heard Suzanne's voice. And, she has this very clear, warm tone to her voice. And so he heard Tom's Diner, and he said, I can use that song as a test in terms of developing the MP3 format. So that's what happened. And because she became the perfect prototype, she honestly earned the name the mother of the MP3.
I love it. That's the minutia moment of the episode right there. I love that little trivia. Yeah. The a cappella version reached number 58 in the UK, number 26 in Ireland. But in 1990, it becomes a massive hit, number 5 in the US, number 2 in the UK when it's released as a dance remix. This remix, not Suzanne's idea, as I just mentioned, nor was it the record label's idea. In fact, this could have led to a lawsuit against the people who released it illegally, but instead, Suzanne and her team, they're smart. They make a deal with this British duo. They're called DNA. Can you give us a timeline for this unexpected remix hit?
So she wrote the song in 82. It was on Solitude Standing in 87, released as a single that same year. And then DNA released the remix version in 1990, soared to number 1 in Austria, Germany, Greece, and Switzerland. And yes, as you said, it was certainly a contentious situation. It could have been a copyright infringement issue. But the thing was that Suzanne said, it's really popular and it's a different version and I kind of like it. Now, Steve Adabo said he wasn't crazy about it. I'm not exactly, at that point, he was kind of speaking for the group, but it sounds like she saw the promise in it. So with that dance beat and with Suzanne then on the record, it was renegotiated. And she did actually go back years later and work with DNA on another tune. So it all worked out.
Luka was the huge breakthrough hit single for Suzanne Vega. It remains her highest charting hit in the US, reaching number 3, number 2 in Sweden, top 10 in Austria, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. Nominated for 3 Grammys. As you write, it's one of her most heartfelt story songs. She addresses child abuse in the lyrics. Although she did know a boy with that name, she said that Luka is an imagined character. You read about how this song went through several incarnations, and there is mention of Suzanne being a fan of the Smiths, which influenced the song as well. Can you talk about that?
Well, if you listen to the Smiths song, The Boy with the Thorn in His Side, you may feel kind of a similar vibe. She was fond of them. And Suzanne wrote the lyric from the heart. There was this young boy who influenced him. I think the vulnerability of the boy and his look and so forth. But of course, it wasn't about him. What I really found fascinating was that the decisions that they made in the studio, it's a painful topic. She does it in first person, so it feels even more personal. She's got a little bit of that waif-like quality sometimes in her voice, so it feels like she could portray a young person. But they weren't influenced in that way with the rest of the song. So it is almost like a poppy dance-like song, and that was intentional. Suzanne didn't want the song to come off as depressing or as preachy, because she wanted it to be a message song, but she didn't want it to be a downer song. And so that lighthearted beat, I think it works effectively. And it also gives the listener sort of this opportunity to reflect. I think that she wanted to be simple and meaningful. I mean, when you think about the structure of the sentences, my name is Luka, I live on the second floor. They're kind of simply structured sentences. There's not a lot of fluff and meat and potatoes. They're very simple sentences. And I think that's one of the reasons we relate so strongly to it. And at the time, I mean, there weren't songs really. It was sort of a stigma writing about something like that. And thank goodness for artists like that who bring things out in the open so we can dialogue, so we can change things, so we can be aware of things that perhaps were under the table. And she also, I think she really moved society forward with that song.
And you say Luka placed her in a position with her fans that she didn't expect. Can you talk about the letters she received from fans?
She was very involved in that process. I think she felt a responsibility, but I think it was unexpected that she would be in that role. And she was quite young herself. She wasn't like she was a psychiatrist or psychologist, that she could be in a position to really know how to counsel people. But she knew that the song touched a chord. And so it was, I suppose it was a little bit of putting her in a tough position. She did commit to answering letters. The fans were grateful. And she, I think in her own way, she did become a healer. But as I said, I think it might be a difficult role. And I've heard of other artists. Tori Amos was also in that role when she wrote songs and fans would say, this is what happened to me. What should I do? It's a tough position for an artist.
Sure is. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Lisa Torem here to talk about her new book, Suzanne Vega, Every Album, Every Song. Suzanne kicks off the next decade with 1990's Days of Open Hand. Number 50 in the U.S., 7 in the U.K. In 2012, Suzanne talked to you about the pressure she felt heading into this record. Can you share what she told you about that experience?
So she was living with her producer, Anton Senko, and she had been used to having a separation between business and personal life. And now they were recording at home. And as we all know, with this pandemic, there's a difference between putting on the suit and staying home in the boxer shorts and drinking cold coffee in the studio and in your room. So this was a little disconcerting for her. And I think she felt stifled creatively because, you know, everything was in the same place, the personal and the business. And so it did affect her. And I think that it affected how she felt about working with that same individual.
3 singles from the album: Book of Dreams, Tired of Sleeping, and Men in a War. Book of Dreams reached the top 10 on the U.S. mainstream and modern rock charts. She did get some criticism for this track. Why was that?
You know, I think we put our artists in a box very often. We brand them just as the labels may do. And she was getting this reputation, or perhaps earlier, as this very introspective, you know, kind of serious artist who thinks about everything she says. Now, this song was not a superfluous lyric. It did not have that, but it did have a pop kind of fun feel. The video was really fun. She was wearing kind of camp clothing on the video. And there's a lot of commentary about that. And so it kind of made some critics go, oh, well, she's not to be taken seriously. And like I said, a lot of times artists get typecast. And she was supposed to be the philosopher, the progressive poet. And sometimes when you deviate from that path, you get demonized.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lovely song. I think it's a really fun and light song, and I love the accompanying video.
I love it too, but she likes to stretch out musically, lyrically, and that's what she does on 92's 99.9 Fahrenheit degrees. A new producer, Mitchell Froome, and we hear Suzanne embrace a more electronic, experimental sound. It reached number 86 in the U.S., number 20 in the U.K. A few modern rock hits from this album. The title track reached number 13. Blood Makes Noise, a number 1 U.S. modern rock track. What is Blood Makes Noise about?
Well, she has explained separately that it exemplifies a feeling of fear and anxiety that originates when you're not communicating well. And so that message is kind of echoed in this loopy instrumental background. Now, Froome, as a producer, he was very careful when he had his original meetings with Suzanne. He came with almost like schematas you might give to an engineering student or something. He had everything planned out, and he knew that she wanted to take things in a different direction. And she wanted to get the ideas that were in her head calculated in a more electronic, sophisticated form compared to how she did things prior to that. Now, she had started writing poetry as a very young girl. She was very conscious of language. And you even think Blood Makes Noise. What a fascinating title. It really makes you think. When you think about Suzanne as a poet, I think she's relatively drawn to abstraction. She's drawn to poetry, the devices of poetry, inner rhymes and alliteration and metaphor. So this was kind of a combination of that plus these new electronic sounds.
By the way, I love In Liverpool. I think
Ah,
that might be my favorite, although I love Blood Makes Noise. I pick out the songs that I love from each album and ask you about them. So if anybody's wondering, there's a method
well,
to
by
the
the way,
madness.
in Liverpool was about a crush that she had when she was a camp counselor,
I know she talked
right?
about it in
That's
concert.
fun.
I was watching the show she did last year at a jazz festival, and she introduced it and talked about it. Yeah, that's so cool.
I love those teen crushes. Yeah.
So there's a 4-year gap between this album and the next. Nine Objects of Desire comes out September of 1996. And this is her 5th studio album, number 43 in the UK, 92 in the US. One critic hailed the album, saying it was comparable to the Beatles' Revolver. That's pretty impressive. The singles are Caramel, the very catchy No Cheap Thrill, and World Before Columbus. Suzanne has said that Caramel is one of the songs she's most proud of. Can you talk about this one, the Latin vibe of the song? One particular song from the mid-60s she's channeling on this track, right?
Girl from Ipanema. What a great song. Antonio Carlos Jobim was a Brazilian genius who wrote wonderful songs and really introduced a lot of Americans to a completely different style of music and vibe. So it was sung by a young singer named Astrid Gilberto, who was very shy and not necessarily wanting to be in the studio, but she had this very warm voice. And it was a kind of voice that was not melodramatic. It was just really similarly to Suzanne, it was kind of voice where you could concentrate on the lyrics because the voice was so expressive but not intrusive. And so Girl from Ipanema, like I said, it opened this window to what we might call world music, which is not really a fair descriptor when you think about it. It kind of clumps everything together. But anyway, Astrid's phrasing was very subtle, allowing the lyrics to shine through. And I believe that when Suzanne wrote Caramel, it was as a result of loving that kind of music because her voice is also warm and sultry and it leaves emotional space for the story. And both of the songs carry this little bit of mystery, like something's held back. And they both speak of fantasy. And there's this seductive Latin beat that underlies both stories. If you hear Girl from Ipanema, you don't know it doesn't describe exactly what she looks like, but you imagine the beach and you can put your own picture in. I think it's the same thing with Caramel. She holds back on a lot of details and we get to imagine some of those details, but we do know she's vulnerable. And I think that comes through very clearly.
And again, stretching out, doing things different. The sound of her music is changing as she goes from album to album. And there's a best of released in 1998. And then Suzanne returns with Songs in Red and Gray, released only a few weeks after 9/11, reached number 178 in the US, 100 in the UK. The top 10 adult alternative radio track, The Widow's Walk, is on there. Last Year's Troubles and Penitent. Penitent. And I'll Never Be Your Maggie May. I love that. That's a reference to Rod Stewart, I'm assuming? Is that kind of?
It's actually a really old theme, a British theme about some character named Maggie May. So it's kind of been recycled, I believe, over the years. But yeah, Rod also made it a really famous portrait.
Cool. Yeah, you note the vocals on Widow's Walk. You write, it's in the chorus that she elicits goosebumps. Can you talk about what and who she's singing about in this song, Widow's Walk?
Well, here she gets really, really honest and emotional. This is a song about her divorce from Mitchell Froome, who had been her producer. And she uses a sinking ship as a metaphor. And the lyrics are absolutely haunting, very visceral, very honest. She sings, though I saw it splinter, I kept looking to the sea. And then she says, and I knew the ship was empty by the time it hit the rocks. So again, like you can hear the inner rhymes. She says, though I saw it splinter. It's a really beautiful line. She's using alliteration. And so she's threading these poetic devices through the song. She also makes great use of dynamics. She doesn't always do that, but in this song, you can hear in the chorus the use of dynamics as compared to the verses. And her vocal range is rich throughout, but there's that unique intensity in the chorus, and it just pulls the verses all together. And fans really related to this song. One of them said, her power is in her ability to express unbelievable pain without self-pity or drama. And the other thing is, I think this song felt like it was in real time. You know, it's first person and every phrase rings true and realistic. And I believe anyone who has watched something precious slip away can appreciate her observations.
6 years passed before the next studio album, which is studio album number 7. Beauty and Crime, released in the summer of 2007, hits 129 in the US, 127 in the UK, wins a Grammy for Best Engineered Album, non-classical. And this is under a new label, the legendary jazz label Blue Note Records. 4 singles from it, including Frank and Ava, which reaches number 20 on the adult alternative charts and number 65 on the UK charts. The other singles, Ludlow Street, Unbound, and Pornographer's Dream. You write, the album wouldn't simply be a rose-colored love story per se about New York City. It would play out with a raw, unconditional perspective. With Beauty and Crime, Vega mirrored and mapped out the temptations, as well as the darkest cul-de-sacs of her hometown. These are new original songs, but they've got an old style orchestration. It seemed like the start of a great relationship with Blue Note, but she's dropped by the label. She was shocked by that. So her next album, 2014's Tales from the Realm of the Queen of Pentacles, it features the single Fool's Complaint, released under her own label now. It's called Amanuensis.
Amanuensis?
Okay, what is amanuensis? What does that mean? And what has Suzanne said about why she chose that name?
It was originally a little inside joke because there's the servant and then there is the masters, as in recording masters, right? Little pun there. Because I imagine most people know the master is the final, finished track, right? But she's kind of using it as, masters, because the recording artist is a servant to the masters. Synonyms are scrivener, transcriber, scribe, or writer. So that's basically what it means in reality. So she was surprised she was dropped by the label, and she had to take stock of her career and make some quick decisions. So she went to work using social media to consolidate her fan base and came up with a plan. Some of that plan involved re-recording her original repertoire because she did own the copyrights. She just didn't own those recordings. So she had the opportunity to reinterpret earlier material. And so she came up with these close-up series. There were 4 albums, and she redid those songs. Jerry Leonard took a big part. Her producer took a big part in working with her on that. And they've been very successful. There's mixed feelings. There's fans that say, "Oh no, I like that recording I heard in the first place." That's always a tough thing. But then a lot of people said, "Oh, I get to hear these songs reimagined with a fresh look." And I thought it was a great way to kind of get over the trauma of that whole experience and say, "Well, I still own these songs. These are my songs, and I'm just going to do something a little different." Mm-hmm.
She explained the meaning behind the album's title, Tales from the Realm of the Queen of Pentacles. What did she say about that?
Well, those 10 tracks are meant to form a link between body and the spirit. And it also alludes to tarot card reading. And the content of the album draws also from Jungian philosophy. So a lot of intense stuff here. And on a promotional video, Suzanne said she felt a warmth and connectedness in this album. I saw her perform tracks such as I Never Wear White. And she and her producer, guitarist Jerry Leonard, they were testing the material out on us. This is a local club. And they seemed like very interested in our responses. This is kind of a fun thing to be in the audience. And they're like really kind of banking on how the audience feels, because what they were doing is testing it out and then going back in the studio and refining it. And she also did a song, Don't Uncork What You Can't Contain. It's like a kind of frenzied word salad. And it was a song on which she actually used a sample of Candy Shop by 50 Cent. This was a new experience for her. And you could understand why she would relate to hip hop, because she loves rhyme and she loves poetry. But that also was a completely new thing for her to do, to sample in other artists.
Yeah, that's cool. October 2016, she released studio album number 9. It's titled Lover, Beloved, Songs from an Evening with Carson McCullers. It's based on the 2011 play Carson McCullers Talks About Love, which is about the life of McCullers. It was written and performed by Suzanne. First, who is Carson McCullers? And second, can you share what Suzanne said to you about her fascination with her?
So Carson McCullers was a Southern writer. She wrote The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. She wrote poignant short stories. Suzanne was originally introduced to her work through a short story called Sucker about kids in a small town trying to define themselves against the odds. And Carson, like Suzanne, felt like an outsider. Suzanne had experienced a lot of feelings like that growing up in Spanish Harlem in New York. And also, they had taken similar turns in their disciplines in terms of education. Carson had ventured from music to writing. Suzanne went from dance and literature to music as a career. And also, Carson was sort of androgynous. It was a time at which it wasn't particularly well regarded to wear non-feminine clothing, but she would wear men's suits. And Suzanne appreciated this kind of androgyny that was ahead of its time. She also wrote sometimes from a male perspective. And there was a song, by the way, called The Instant of the Hour that Suzanne wrote with Duncan Sheik. And it was based on one of Carson's short stories. It's about alcoholism, and it's just striking in its details. So I think she was a major influence.
And a single from the album, We of Me, a song about an outsider, which Suzanne told you she could relate to. What did she tell you about that?
Yeah, one of the lines is, the world is a subtle place if you don't believe in anything. That's one of the primary lyrics. It was adapted again from the story of Carson McCullers, A Member of the Wedding. And it was about trying to deal with several people at the same time, which can result in heightened emotions. The album contains a lot of depth. The We of Me is actually one of the lighter songs on the album. It was added to the original musical that you mentioned. And that musical preceded and inspired the album that we also talked about. But it's actually, compared to a lot of the other songs that were really, I would say, ranging from bittersweet to tragic, and some of them were very witty, it was actually one of the lighter moments.
That would be, at least for now, the last studio album from Suzanne Vega. Before I ask you about what's going on with Suzanne these days, I didn't even ask you, what was the first song you heard from her?
I think it was Luka. I think it was. And that's such a great entree into her work.
And your first time you saw her live?
Oh, wow. I don't know, 8 years ago or something.
Okay. Yeah.
Exactly sure.
She's a great performer too. She's really great with the crowd. And lately she's had that really was a top hat she wears on stage. That's
right.
Cool. That's cool.
She loves kind of the Broadway schmaltzy stuff.
Yes.
I think it's sort of her alter ego, because she's kind of, I think she has she's a little bit shy, I think.
Yep.
I think that brings out another Suzanne.
All right. What about favorite album, favorite song?
Oh, boy. That's so tough. Can you call me in 2 weeks?
Part two?
Yeah.
Well, let's go through. I'm going to read off the titles to just inspire you to come up with a decision here. Let's see. The self-titled 1985 debut, Solitude Standing, Days of Open Hand, 99.9 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 Objects of Desire, Songs in Red and Gray, Beauty and Crime, Tales from the Realm of the Queen of Pentacles, and the last is Lover Beloved, Songs from an Evening with Carson McCullers. Do you go old? Do you go early days, Suzanne Vega, old school, or?
Oh boy.
If you had to pick one, Desert Island, Suzanne Vega disc.
I guess Solitude Standing, but it's hard to say. Sort of like the guy that you like when you're 17, you never forget. You know what I mean? It's sort of those early days you can't really get out of your mind. Yeah, I mean, I did love. I thought it was just full of hits.
Today it's Solitude Standing. We'll go with that.
Yeah, for today. Call me at 3 a.m. I'll have
And favorite song? Do you have one that you just immediately love? You just go to?
Yes, Small Blue Thing is just my absolute favorite. Just an absolutely beautiful song. And when you ask people, I asked some people, well, what is that song? And oh my goodness, she talks about in the book. People came up with so many interpretations. Somebody said, oh, I think it's a fetus. Somebody said, oh, I think it's about abuse. There was a line falling down the stairs. Somebody said, oh, it's about the world. It's about the globe. I mean, it just brought to mind so many different interpretations, but it's an absolutely beautiful song. The pacing, the lyric, the instrumental is subtle. Yeah, that's probably my favorite, actually.
Small Blue Thing from the first album. Has she ever talked about what it's about?
she does hold a little something back, but I think she actually found this little object like a doorknob, and she has this sense of visual. She's very visual, and she was kind of turning it around, and it just all these images, I believe, kind of came into her consciousness. I don't think it was deliberate, but I think the images started coming, and not all of us have that talent where we take an ordinary object.
I was just about to say, I envy that skill, and I
Right.
envy songwriters. It's just amazing. It just blows my mind. I think that's why we're such fans. How
It
do
could
you
be
come up
super
with
annoying. You have a doorknob and you can't stop thinking about these
like an
qualities. Get out of
OCD?
the house.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, what is the latest with Suzanne? I see she's on tour from checking out her website, which, by the way, I think she's coming around here to Connecticut soon. I think in the fall. I
Oh,
really
well,
want to
she
see
loves
her.
East Coast. Yeah.
Yeah. Is a 10th studio album in the near future?
I don't have any clues about that. She's finishing up in France, and then she's going to be touring in the US. And then next year in April, she's going to be touring in cities in the US. But she says that she didn't say it to me, but she's adding more cities, it says on her website. So, I think more cities will be there. I know she loves going to Europe. And she's still promoting an evening of New York songs and stories, which came out a few years ago. And she's performing highlights from her repertoire and with commentary. It's kind of a fun album because it was recorded at Cafe Carlisle in New York, which is a very she kind of club. And so she went so far as to actually like comment to the audience, which is something that she had a little trouble doing earlier in her career. But the last few years, I think she's been wanting to see what it's like to get away from the guitar, see what it's like to be more of an actor. And of course, when she did the Carson McCullers musical, she was able to move and not be with the guitar. So I think there's this whole other Suzanne that keeps coming out that's experimenting. And so then talking to the audience is just a whole other thing. I think she really loves it, but this was sort of little quips about each song that were recorded that are now for posterity. It was a little different than some of her other albums where there wasn't any of that.
She's still pushing forward, still doing things differently.
Yeah.
That's cool. So much is covered in the book, that so much more than what we covered here. Suzanne Vega, every album, every song, including Suzanne's live.
And I have one little
Go ahead.
Aaron.
Oh, well, I know this is the upcoming appearance for you, right?
Yes, it is.
Let's do that first, then we'll plug the book. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to Manchester, UK, for the Louder Than Words Fest in November 10th through 12th. And I'm going to be doing two things. I'm going to be moderating a talk with John Philip Chanel, who has been Tori Amos's arranger for 34 years and is still going, and as well as with so many other acts. I'll be moderating his talk about being an arranger. And I'm also going to be doing my own talk on Sunday, November 12th, about writing and all things connected to that, and interviewing and all that fun stuff.
I love that.
Looking forward to it. So come down, bring your Mac. It's going to be raining probably, your umbrella. And
well, how are you feeling about it? Are you a little nervous to get on stage, or what?
Well, what's so interesting is I've been interviewing people, and I've been interviewed like we are today. And
right now.
What an experience.
It's different. It's a whole different thing. I know. Every time I'm a guest, I feel like you're not behind the driver's wheel. So you're kind of like, I'm not sure where we're going to go with this.
Yeah, completely different experience, but I love it. It's great.
Let's get back to plugging the book. So is it out now, Suzanne Vega, every album, every song?
It is out in the UK. It's going to come out in the States a little bit later, and it's available on Amazon, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and it's Instagram, right? Is that the name of it?
I think you're on Instagram. I think we are connected on Instagram, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have our publisher at the booth in Manchester. So it's always fun for me as a writer to engage, because a lot of people will say, oh yeah, I've heard a few songs from that artist, but where do I go now? And so it's always fun to be in that situation and say, well, how about this one?
Yeah.
So that's always fun.
And the publisher, by the way, Sonic Bond.
Yes.
Who I've had a great relationship with since I started this podcast. Will Stephen Lamb be there?
He will indeed.
Yes. Tell Stephen I said hello.
Big party. Thank you.
Yeah, he's been on once to talk about his book on Yes. So yeah, it's all covered in the book, not just the studio albums, but live albums, her series of acoustic albums, You covered all her guest appearances, compilation albums. It's a must for all Suzanne Vega fans. It's out now through Sonic Bond. You can get it in the U.S. through Amazon when it's out in the U.S., but in the U.K., Burning Shed. I'll put the links up on the show notes page, and people can find you online at Facebook, Twitter. We could put the links up as well for that.
Perfect.
All right, Lisa, thank you so much. Great to have you back on, and until next time, you got to write another book so we can have you back on.
Okay. I'll start tonight.
Thanks, Lisa. This was awesome.
Bye-bye.
That's it. It's in the books.